Hello everyone around the world today. This is Space Café WebTalk 33 minutes with Raphael Roettgen, and we will begin soon. Thanks for joining us for this exciting event. I would like to thank you for your terrific feedback about last week's Space Café event with Moriba Jah. Your comments were very insightful. I am Torsten Kriening, your host today and co-publisher of SpaceWatch.Global. We are a Switzerland-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activity in a geopolitical context. Many of you know our website and our bi-weekly newsletter. Yesterday, we launched our new daily newsletter called SpaceWatch.Global Today. Check your inbox or subscribe to the newsletter on our website. We will be hosting these Space Café Web Talks on a weekly basis. I hope you will mark Tuesdays at the same time in your calendars. Please be informed that we are recording this webinar session and we will make this available on SpaceWatch.Global in a few days. We are also streaming the Space Café on Facebook Live on the SpaceWatch Middle East page. So hello Facebook world. I would like to ask, if you would like to ask questions, I mean, I do have a lot of questions already about the topic, but if you would like to ask questions, just use the Q&A section on the webinar screen. You can also vote for questions. If we don't get to your question during the session, we will follow up with you later. My guest today is my ISU fellow, colleague and friend, Raphael Roettgen. Raphael provides financial advice to and investment proprietary capital in space companies as a managing director and founder of E2MC. He also advises institutional advisors, investors, not advisors, and governments on space. Previously, Raphael has held senior roles at global investment banks and hedge funds, and was also a fintech entrepreneur in Brazil. He holds degrees in finance from Wharton School, machine learning from PUC Rio, and space studies from the International Space University in Strasbourg, as well as the CFA and FRM charters. Today, he joins us from Zurich. Raphael, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks, Torsten. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. Yes, I'm working from home from my Zurich home, so apologize if my cat walks across the keyboard at any time, which is likely to happen. Okay, so this is supposed to be a review of the space financing investing activity for the first quarter of 2020, which obviously just ended. So just a few slides about that, and then I'll turn it over to you, Torsten, because as you said, you have a lot of questions for me apparently. So on the first slide, we just have a summary. We have about $560 million of investments in space-related companies over 32 different financing transactions. That is excluding the current fundraising that SpaceX is doing. As some of you may know, SpaceX is raising at least $250 million, by some reports up to $500 million. And as of the last SEC filing, that's in mid-March, they had already raised $221 million of that. Now, excluding that, as I said, $560 million, that's significantly lower, just a number, as the first quarter of 2019. However, you have to keep in mind here, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, I'm sure Torsten is going to ask me, the first quarter of 2019 included like 1.25 billion just for OneWeb by itself. You have here the top 10 transactions. We're going to talk a little bit more about, in more detail about this, but you can already see that some of the biggest transactions are in satellite communications, and in fact, all of the biggest transactions are in satellite communications, which is probably not surprising because that's still a sector where many investors see the potential for near-term returns and just potentially very large markets. Okay, next slide, please.
I think you can control it by yourself.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure I can, actually.
However, I will do that for you, if I can. Here we are.
Thank you. So this is the breakdown again for the first quarter. We're only going to be talking about the first quarter of 2020 today. This is by geography. And I suppose what you see here, but this is not, very different, frankly, from other quarters and other years. It's just the dominance of the United States in space. It's just far ahead of anybody else, both in terms of number of transactions as well as value of transactions. You see France here, the only reason they're in second place by value of transactions is this one transaction for the IoT company, Kineis, which was $110 million. Next slide. I'm sorry, I should add here that if we included today, Australia would have jumped up quite a bit in the geographic ranking, because some of you may have seen Mariota, which is yet another IoT company, IoT as an Internet of Things, announced a $20 million Series B now down in Australia. So by subsector, again, we already saw that a little bit on the first slide. The dominant sectors are your usual suspects. It's satellite communications, remote sensing, and launch. You see remote sensing twice on here. One is remote sensing DS. That's DS as in downstream for people who analyze data but do not own their own satellite constellations. So obviously, if you combine those two, then remote sensing would further move up a little bit. And again, those sectors dominate both by value of transaction as well as by number of transactions. In case you're wondering, orbit services. Everybody defines these space categories a little bit differently. What we packed into orbit services here, specifically in the first quarter 2020, that includes companies like the space debris guys, so Astroscale in Japan and ClearSpace in Switzerland. Yeah, next slide, please. The same breakdown by type of funding, or if you want, by stage as well. That's a little bit less reliable. There's just a lot of data missing, a lot of raw data missing. But unsurprisingly here, it's the biggest part is venture rounds, like lettered venture rounds. A little bit less seed. Actually, typically, if you look across the years and across quarters, definitely by number of transactions, you would have more seed. And then interestingly, we even had one equity crowdfunding this quarter. I checked earlier today, that's actually still going on. That's an electric propulsion company out of the US, which I think is already up to almost $200,000 on their crowdfunding. So it's an interesting alternative. Next slide, please. Here we're looking at the funding rounds in the first quarter by types of investors. We had just over 70 unique investors in this quarter. Roughly 2/3 of them appear to have invested in space for the first time. Again, we don't always have all of the data, but it seems to be thereabout. That includes a number of Chinese VC firms and 2 or 3 Chinese rounds we had. If you look at the breakdown by type of investor, VC is almost always, unsurprisingly, the biggest share of the financing rounds. Corporates are a little bit higher here than on historical average. That includes, by the way, corporates as the corporate entities themselves, or it could also be the venture arms of the corporates. Other institutionals is a catch-all category that includes, for example, banks, but also things like insurance companies and family offices. Okay, next slide, please. So because of what's currently going on with the coronavirus and everything, we thought we should run an analysis where we look kind of at the financing activities, the number of rounds over time. And it's kind of meaningless to look at it on a daily basis because there just isn't enough rounds. Also monthly, we would only have 3 months in this quarter. So we looked at it on a weekly basis. The outcome didn't surprise us. You can't really see any clear trend here yet. It's just too early in my mind to see any impact in data of announced transactions from the coronavirus. You have to keep in mind that anything that's announced now, probably will have been worked on normally for many, many months. And again, Mariota, which announced its 20 million Series B in Australia today, that's a prime example. I know the situation. I know it's been going on since sometime last year. It just happens to announce now. So if people are very far down the road, then obviously they will try to close their rounds. Now, in 1, 2, 3, 4 months, probably we'll start seeing some impact of a slowdown in the financing activity. Next slide, please. However, for completeness, we ran the same analysis, so the week by week announced financing rounds, not only for space. Space is the blue graph on top, so the same one as in the slide before, but also for like any financing round for any venture, any sector, any country. And that's the red line underneath. And maybe not, we can already see like a little bit of impact here in the last 2 data points, but it might just be a fluke. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, we also decided to quickly take a look at the public markets. I mean, as you're probably aware, unfortunately, there is not a lot of, publicly listed space-related companies yet. We're excluding anything here like, Lockheed or Boeing, because if you actually look what percentage of revenue and of profits comes from space for those companies, it's in the single digits. So we only, include some companies here, and those are not all of them, but it's a good part, which are really clearly space focused. And they've all suffered along with the public markets. As you see, it's some very significant drops here. The last column is basically where they currently trade versus their highest price over the last 52 weeks, as in over the last year. Now, why are we looking at this? I mean, we have the flexibility to invest both in the private and the public markets, but I think it's also important for people to kind of keep this in mind, because it may impact you indirectly. So, for example, if you're fundraising, you may have some classes of investors, like, for example, many family offices can invest across asset classes. So A, they may be suffering both in their private and public portfolio right now and be focused on those two parts. But also if they do, look at new investment opportunities and they're not limited to just looking at the private market, they may also kind of spend a little bit more time on the public markets now if they think that there's very attractive investment opportunities there. And frankly, even, I mentioned family offices as an example, but even VCs, you think, okay, VCs, especially those which have recently raised, they may be immune from that because, they have a very specialized investment mandate. Maybe, but maybe not, because it might be that they have problems in their LP base, so that their investors were impacted by coronavirus, and that has then follow-on impacts on the VC fund. Next slide, please. I think that's actually, we're done. Okay, cool. Torsten, back over to you.
That's it. Oh, thank you very much. I just want to encourage our audience to send in your questions. We are happy to answer them. So, but let me go ahead and kick off these questions, Raphael. First topic, and you mentioned it earlier already, COVID-19, Corona, and the space industry, and COVID-19 and the space entrepreneurship. Please share your thoughts on that with us.
Well, I mean, it's going to have an impact. It already has an impact. And I think, across the board, in the most generic way, it's just going to push stuff out time-wise. It might push stuff out time-wise on your executions, on your milestones as an entrepreneur, because, it might be the case that due to the restrictions, the social distancing and the various other restrictions in various countries around the world, that you probably cannot work as normal. Like, if you have a team that needs to work together, everybody close to each other in integrating some sort of equipment, that's probably going to be difficult at the moment. Even if that's not the case for what you're doing, it might be the case at one of your suppliers, so it's going to have an impact there. Or it might be the case at one of your customers, so that they're slowing down the orders. And that's just on the operational side. Obviously, on the fundraising side, as I said, it's too early to see anything in the numbers, but certainly anecdotally, I can tell you, we start seeing things like people pulling away from term sheets, people trying to negotiate down valuations of rounds, people just generally pushing stuff out, people just moving the focus from new investment opportunities towards taking care of their existing portfolio, making sure everything is okay there. And that's totally understandable. I think everything is going to move out time-wise. Now, I think if you're an entrepreneur, how should you be looking at this? I think first of all, you obviously want to make sure that you live the fight another day, so to say. So you really want to be sure about your runway and about your liquidity. So that includes things like, you make sure if you have any sort of credit lines, any like outstanding amounts, that you call them down and to increase your liquidity. If there's anything you can negotiate, whether that's, say, your rent or something else, you should certainly be doing that. You should definitely be reviewing all your costs. Unfortunately, that's going to include payroll sometimes. Yeah, that all sounds kind of, very pessimistic. I also want to leave it like an optimist note here. Look, as an investor and also as an advisor to some other investors, there are also positive sides. I think, earlier this year, I was shown some investment situations where I really thought the valuations had gotten unreasonably frothy. And I think we're going to obviously see a reset of all of those now. So there might be some good deals around for investors, and I'm very much looking forward to that. And then for people who are thinking about becoming an entrepreneur, this may sound very strange, but I think this is a fantastic time for many reasons. I mean, first of all, because many people probably think it's crazy to start a company now, you will have much less competition. Secondly, usually you would be worried about, will there be a recession at some point in time that's going to impact my business plan? Well, we're already in the middle of a recession now. So probably the next one is going to take longer. So you have like a little bit more certainty on that. Thirdly, probably all of your input costs are going to be cheaper. And that includes, this is a fourth point, like staff, people. There's probably a lot of qualified people around to hire right now. So for all of these reasons, I think, and sorry, I forgot one. Look at how many stimulus packages governments are preparing around the world. And some of that stimulus money can find its way directly or indirectly to space startups. So for all of these reasons, I think it's actually a really interesting time to consider starting a company.
You mentioned the business plan. Did the value of business plans changed at the moment?
I'm sorry?
Did the value of business plans, as you mentioned, business plans changed for now? So, I mean, we have seen over the last years a lot of business plans with many speculations in it, many bold visions, to say it at last. Will that now be dropped to a more realistic level? Or let me take over that to a very concrete example or bridge that over to the OneWeb's bankruptcy and its implication for the entire industry. Can you give us a short answer on that, about their fundraising? What is the value of their assets, spectrum license? I mean, I know it's a very tough question for a very short format, and we will take it forward potentially later. But
we could talk for hours about that.
Sure.
And I don't have any particular inside information on OneWeb. What I will say is, I think a few people were actually, unfortunately, not surprised by this. There has obviously been a number of issues with the company. I mean, part of the issue was obviously the main investor, the SoftBank Vision Fund, with all of the baggage that came from that. There have been some other company-specific issues. For example, about the cost structure. I mean, it's just the fact, and you know that I'm also a SpaceX investor. It's just the fact that OneWeb has a material cost disadvantage compared to its two main competitors, SpaceX's Starlink, and then Amazon Kuiper, because both of the others effectively have vertical integration into launch, which of course is one of the most significant cost items. There was also some other strange things in OneWeb in the cost structure, which I never understood. For example, I think they never wanted to go for inter-satellite laser links. And without going into too much detail, one consequence that has, if you don't have those laser links in orbit, you probably need much more extensive ground infrastructure, which obviously requires capital expenditures. So I think there was a few issues. It's going to be interesting to see what happens now. In terms of assets, I mean, look, I think you have, from memory, something like 74 satellites in polar orbits, and I think it's 3 different shells, all polar. Don't know whether that's interesting to anybody. You have some spectrum rights, some very early KU band spectrum rights, some Ka band spectrum rights that might be of interest to people. You have some landing rights in some countries around the world. I forget now where. That might be of interest to people. So they're obviously trying to run a sale process right now. Not all of this has to go to the same people. It doesn't have to be sold as a going concern. I mean, in many ways, it isn't a going concern yet, I suppose. It could just go into liquidation and people pick up the various pieces. We shall see. Obviously, there's already repercussions in terms of the people, many qualified people who unfortunately got laid off. But again, I hope they find new jobs with other space companies and throughout the supply chain.
Cool. I mean, I know that's a very long topic to where we could dive into much deeper, but a quick last question from me before we hand over to the audience. Kines, are the French the only significant European space investor from the last month with a 110 million. Can you give us your view on them, please?
So I must say, I'm not very close to Kines, so I don't have like a whole lot of information there. Kines is yet another Internet of Things satellite communications players. This has been, a hot subsector. There is a few startups playing in Internet of Things now. I mean, first of all, you have established players, right? I mean, arguably Iridium, the granddaddy of satellite communications. They're mostly an IoT player these days. But then you have many startups. Swarm in the US, they announced that they have basically all of the regulatory licenses to start today. Mariota, which we mentioned in Australia. Fleet is another one in Australia. The Kuna Space. There's a few others I'm forgetting. There's at least a dozen. So it's been one of those. It's received obviously a material amount of funding. It was 100 million euros, so about $108 million round. The only thing I noticed about that round, it seems like it was pretty much let's call it a French solution, and that all of the investors I saw in that round were French. It's basically some VCs, some corporates, CNES, the French Space Agency. And interestingly, today in the Mariota announcement, I mean, the investor base is actually international, but if you look at the two lead investors, they're Australian. And I think that's interesting. I think it's always very positive when countries support their emerging space ecosystem. And I wish there would be more and more of that. And some countries are good at that, right? Luxembourg is excellent at that. The UAE is excellent at that. Frankly, the US is excellent at that. And I hope that, most countries who have an interest in building the space ecosystem will come around and do that. And by the way, not only with investments, but there's other ways to support your fledgling space companies. So a lot of these services like SATCOM and Earth observation have clear use cases for government purposes. So I think that's another way in which countries can help the fledgling space ecosystems.
Let me hand over to a few questions, and we have about 20 of them. And again, we promise we come back to you on your questions or in our email on Friday, and we'll group them. One from Chaitanya, my good friend, who has also birthday today. So happy birthday, Chaitanya, on that way. He asked, we had a fairly encouraging ESA ministerial conference in Sevilla last year. Is there any positive impact are expected in the VC market when it comes to funding space in Europe? Or will the market continue to be as risk averse as it was before? Your view on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wish I knew. It kind of ties in sort of my last answer, the last thing I said. I wish there was like a little bit more going on to the same extent that's going on in the US, in Europe as well. I know it's many countries. There's a whole coordination issues. There's actually quite a few support programs in Europe. Sometimes it's probably almost too complicated and it takes a little time to understand, between Horizon 2020 and ESA incubators, and there's so many of them. But I think overall, probably even more could be done in terms of organizing that, simplifying it, and getting the money into the hand of space startups. Now in the VC community, it's true we haven't really seen as much in Europe as in the US, but I mean that's obviously true across sectors. I mean there's the interesting data points, with like VCs, even prominent VCs, investing for the first time in space. I mean the example that comes to mind is Early Bird investing in ESA Aerospace's round in Germany the end of last year.
Another question from Neil Mither. Is it a good time to start a startup or a venture into human space flight, particularly?
Well, okay, let me answer this in different ways. So I think I already laid out that I think it's in general a good time for startups. So the various reasons for that. So rather than repeating that, let me try to focus on the human spaceflight. Human spaceflight is obviously, I mean, they say space is hard. It's probably fair to say that human spaceflight is even harder for all of the, sort of certification requirements if you do it in certain countries, and the life support systems you need, and all of that. I personally do hope we see many more humans in space this decade. And I'm very bullish on the whole subsector of space tourism. I know I want to go to space. I know so many of my friends and acquaintances who want to go to space. and yes, for the moment, it's obviously limited to a certain, you need a certain level of resources, of monetary resources to do that. But the price should come down over time. And as the price comes down, I think you're going to dip into more and more demand layers. So I think space tourism could be huge. So if you include that in sort of the human spaceflight definition, I think it should be included. Then by all means, I think this is a very interesting sector. I do think, obviously, a couple of obvious caveats. One, you would have to convince me as an investor, for example, why are you the right person to do that? What makes you particularly qualified to deal with such a complicated topic as human spaceflight? And then, for example, if you go into the space tourism arena, you have already some extremely strong and extremely well-financed competitors. You also have to kind of define a niche where you can credibly compete within a reasonable time frame.
We have a few questions or remarks from people asking if you would like to help them in their investment, and I think the answer will be a clear yes. And I'm happy to connect you with them. We have questions from Tibor about the executive order that came out yesterday. I think we skipped it. It's another very complex topic for another big Space Café. But one last question from Jörg Kreisel. Do you expect a fight for solution-based takeovers or investments at lower valuation due to the situation?
A fight?
Is that an effect? Yeah.
That would be fantastic. I mean, if we actually, well, not for me personally as a space investor, I'd obviously like to have less competition. But if we get, a level of interest where people start, fighting over assets, that would be very positive. I'm not sure yet. I don't know. I just repeat, I do think this is an interesting time to start. Many times, during crises like this, it's just a really good time to start investing. I mean, even at E2MC, my firm, right, we're going to definitely accelerate like raising our own capital pool to make space investments, because we just foresee there's going to be many more investment opportunities at attractive valuations. Now, of course, if there are enough other people thinking like me, and to some extent this has already happened, right, then suddenly you will have a lot of space funds, and there might be a fight. It's true.
So to summarize that, the COVID-19 crisis where we are in will not be the end of space or space entrepreneurship or space invest. So I like you're saying, and your encouraging words are to the audience are that it's time now to think really into it. A few or a last word from your end before we close it off here.
Again, thanks, Torsten, for having me. It was a pleasure and it was fun. And I really want to reinforce the positive message. If you're thinking about being an entrepreneur in space, consider looking at it now. I think, crises like these are actually, for the reasons I mentioned, a really fantastic time. And also consider, like, in some ways, COVID has shown us even some positive things for space. I mean, we're doing an online webinar here. Everybody is sitting at home, like using a broadband internet connection. Here in Switzerland, there was some talk of the government, restricting access to streaming services like Netflix because the communication network was completely overburdened. If anything, so that's, for example, potential demand for satellite broadband communications. I can also see, some potential Earth observation applications coming out of this. So again, I know it's a bleak moment right now, but we'll come out of this. And I think, there's, for the reasons I mentioned, this could be a very interesting time to get involved.
Great, and I think it's worth to mention here as well that you're providing a monthly overview about these financing our activities in space on SpaceWatch.Global, and we are very happy to have that. So, and with that, yeah, thanks again. We now can run it for quite some time here, and we will potentially take this entire topic a few more times in our series. So, Raphael, thank you again. So for all of you who are online, our next webinars are on 14th of April with Carla Sharp, who will talk about a few space initiatives in Africa. On 21st of April, we will have Dr. Brian Whedon about the 2020 edition of the Counter Space Capacity Study. And on the 28th of April, we will have Daniel Porras with us on the question, is it too late to prevent an arms race in outer space? We would like to get your feedback. So please check in with us on Twitter, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, send a pigeon over or whatever. If you're interested in if you are interested in being a guest on our 33 minutes with, please let us know. Don't forget to sign up to our daily or bi-weekly newsletters. So thank you very much. Thanks, Raphael. Thank you again to my entire team behind the scenes. You made an incredible job again. So for all of you, stay safe, wash your hands, and thank you for joining us. See you next week. Bye for now.
Thanks. Bye-bye.